As you might know if you've watched some of my other videos, I'm a huge Jane Austen fan, and Persuasion is actually my favorite of her novels. So, as you can imagine, I have opinions about the new Netflix movie. I guess my biggest observation is that the story that they're telling in it is, on the surface, very much like Jane Austen's Persuasion. It's the same story of this girl who turns down the guy because he's not good enough for her family, and then he shows up rich and important and, the guy that every girl is crushing on, and ooh, he's the one that got away, and she still has feelings for him. Like, it is that story. However, as I was watching the movie, the main thought going through my head was, this is not Persuasion. It's not so much that the plot has changed, or even that the characters have changed, although some of them have changed a little bit, and Anne, the main character, has changed a lot, and that's something that I will get to in a little bit. But really the biggest differences are in things that are a little bit harder to put your finger on, but that make a huge difference. The mood, the style, the tone, all of that shifts dramatically in this movie adaptation. The novel Persuasion is one of Jane Austen's most serious works. I would say that it and Mansfield Park are her two most serious works. It's a very slow-moving, melancholy story that ultimately reaches a happy ending, but for the most part is not lighthearted, funny, or anything like that. Certainly not in the way that, say, Emma or Northanger Abbey is. The movie, on the other hand, it's portrayed as like a very lighthearted, funny romantic comedy. And that doesn't work. That is not the story of Persuasion at all. The other thing that changes is that it is very modernized. There are uses of modern terminology, vocabulary that just wasn't around in Jane Austen's time. Like, for instance, characters use the scale of 1 to 10 to talk about, who's attractive. If you're a 5 in London, you're a 10 in Bath. And calling each other, a 6 or a 10 or whatever. I'm pretty sure they didn't do that in the early 19th century. Just taking a wild guess here. And there's a lot of stuff like that. Anne refers to herself and Captain Wentworth as exes. Mary talks about being an empath and needing self-care. I think the scale of 1 to 10 thing was the thing that was the most jarring for me and made it the hardest to suspend disbelief on this being said in the 19th century. But there's definitely a lot of modern vocabulary and language that just wouldn't have been a thing in the 19th century. Another big change was the main character, Anne's personality. Anne from the movie really has very little in common with Anne from the book, other than her basic circumstances, like her family and the fact that she turned down the love of her life and things like that. Personality-wise, she feels a little bit like a 21st century woman dropped into the 19th century. She drinks a lot of alcohol, she makes snarky comments about her family or the social expectations of the time. Why is it assumed that every woman wants to be swept off her feet by a man? Or I forget exactly how it was worded, but something like that, which, that's a very modern sentiment, I think. In some ways, it seems like they were trying to make her more like Elizabeth Bennet, in terms of just being very headstrong, obstinate, and kind of ahead of her time in terms of her way of thinking and whatnot. And while I do like Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice, Anne is a completely different character. And it really doesn't work to try and take aspects of Elizabeth's personality and impose them on Anne, along with just a whole bunch of other stuff that isn't Anne either. I don't like the implication that a woman with Anne's personality in the novel wouldn't make a good protagonist. There's nothing wrong with her in the novel. Yes, she's a little bit more reserved and more mature. Makes sense that she would be because she is the oldest of Jane Austen's heroines. She has a very strong sense of duty and obligation, which can sometimes be a fault in her, given that, it's what makes her turn down Captain Wentworth, something that she eventually comes to regret. But then also it can be a positive thing, like in her interactions with Mrs. Smith, for instance, who is a close friend of hers who's now impoverished and widowed and who she chooses to spend time with because she has the integrity to honor their friendship and the plans that they had made together over other things that her family thinks are more important. And also just look at the fact that despite having been persuaded to turn down Captain Wentworth, she couldn't be persuaded to marry someone that she wasn't in love with. hence why she turned down Mr. Musgrove. Yes, that does happen in the movie as well, but my point is there's plenty to work with in Anne's character without making her into something that she's not. In some ways, I was very strongly reminded of the 1999 adaptation of Mansfield Park. Like Persuasion, Mansfield Park is relatively difficult to adapt and has a main character who often doesn't really resonate with modern audiences. Although, I feel like Anne might work a little bit better for, a modern audience than Fanny from Mansfield Park, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into here because that's not the point here. The point is that both of them, despite sticking to the same basic storylines as the novels that they're based on, change the style and the tone of the story enough that it becomes something completely different, and also make significant changes to the characters' personalities. Another similarity between the two that I noticed was that, like Fanny from the 1999 version of Mansfield Park, Anne in this adaptation of Persuasion has a tendency to talk directly to the viewer. She looks at the camera and talks about what's going on around her, usually saying things that she wouldn't say to people's faces, or just offering snarky commentary about everything. I can totally see Elizabeth from Pride and Prejudice, or Emma Woodhouse from Emma, doing something very similar. If you're willing to accept that kind of thing in a movie, it would be very in character for them. Or even for Catherine from Northanger Abbey, although I feel like her commentary would be very different. It would be interesting, I think, to see the difference between what she thinks is going on and what you actually see going on around her. Because she thinks that she's very perceptive, but she's not really. Anne, on the other hand, she just, again, it makes her character something very different from who she was in the novel, and that bothers me because I like who she was in the novel. There are two more really big things that I have a problem with, but before we get into that, let's talk about a few of the things that I liked. I really liked some of the minor characters and how they were represented. A couple of specific ones: Sir Walter Elliot, Anne's father. I thought he was portrayed exceptionally well. Seemed very much like I imagined him when reading the book. Louisa, I think, was a little bit of a different take on the character, but I liked what they added. I liked that she seemed to have genuine feelings for Captain Wentworth and wasn't just being a flirt. And they managed to, I think, portray her relationship with Anne very well, in that she seemed aware of the past between them and didn't want to do anything that would hurt Anne, but felt like she really could see a future for herself with Captain Wentworth. I loved that. I thought that it was great. And then Mary Musgrove was perfect in, like, a super annoying kind of way. Like, I couldn't stand her, but I think that's the point. And the constant complaining and whining and feeling sorry for herself and everything, it worked. Even some of the things that were a little bit modernized, like when she starts talking about self-care and it's obvious that she just means being selfish. Like, she totally would be the kind of woman in the modern day who would talk about self-care and really just mean, I get to be totally selfish and do whatever I want. I think that that's very much in line with her personality in the book, even if the concept of self-care and that terminology is an anachronism. Secondly, while I did think that the chemistry between Anne and Captain Wentworth was a little bit lacking, I liked the slow transition from exes who are, like, coldly polite to each other to friends to then falling in love with each other again, or rather admitting that they were still in love, and the growing mutual respect between them. I'm glad that they understood what an important part of the story that was. Because at the beginning it feels very much like he doesn't respect her anymore, and what she did not only broke his heart, but lost his good opinion of her. And then she slowly regains that over the course of the novel, or the movie. Without the deep yearning and longing that's portrayed in other versions, and with the more lighthearted and humorous tone, I don't think they captured quite as much of it. But that is still there. They even added to it in some ways. Like the scene where he mentions that when he had to make difficult decisions as a captain in the Navy, he would often think of what she would do because she had, good instincts and a selfless nature and tended to make good decisions. That respect for, even though her, making good decisions and following duty above selfish desires led her to reject him, it's still something that he respected about her. And then he tells her that she would be a good admiral. I don't remember anything like that in the novel or other adaptations of it that I've seen, and it probably would be, again, not really appropriate for the time period for a man to think that a woman would do well in the military. But I do think that as far as signaling that he has a lot of respect for her and that he sees in her someone who is intelligent and capable and selfless, it worked. Another thing that I'm not quite sure how I feel about it, and all I can really do is explain what I noticed, because, like I said, I have mixed feelings. I felt like the portrayals of Lady Russell and Mr. Elliot were a lot more likable in this adaptation. In the novel, I got the impression of Lady Russell as someone who, while she would claim that she was looking after Anne's best interests, was really just kind of projecting her own desires onto her, not really caring whether they suited her or not. In the movie, I got the impression that Lady Russell was really trying to help and was genuinely sorry if her advice had caused Anne pain. So that was a difference that I think it was necessary in order to make it work with the lighthearted romantic comedy kind of format and everything. I don't know how I feel about the way that it changes the story. And then with Mr. Elliot, in a very similar way, well, he did have the same game plan and he used the same methods and everything. The fact that he was so upfront and honest with Anne about it, I think, makes it a little bit better, makes him a little bit less despicable. Now, granted, he still cheats on her. So, not good, not likable, not desirable. She totally dodged a bullet there. But the fact that he was totally honest about how he wants her father's title, he doesn't want her father to have a son, he doesn't want her father to remarry, and that's why he is there, that's why he is doing all of this. That was a twist in the novel. Having her be totally beguiled by someone who seems like a charming gentleman and turns out to be a scoundrel, it wouldn't work as well, I don't think, with the lighter tone of this movie. It is an essential part of the book, and I have mixed feelings about getting rid of that. But I also kind of liked the portrayal of Mr. Elliot. Like, not as a romantic lead or anything. I wouldn't want to see Anne get together with him. I wouldn't, want to daydream about him myself. But just, I thought that he was interesting. I thought he was one of the more, I don't know, not likable, but one of the more believable characters. I don't know. So I have mixed feelings about Lady Russell and Mr. Elliot, but I did enjoy their characters in this adaptation, and that's not something that I was anticipating. Alright, so we have arrived at the things that I cannot stand. First of all, they changed the love letter. Yes, they kept a lot of the original language, but they mixed the sentences up. They cut the part where he said, "I offer myself to you again with a heart even more your own than when you nearly broke it." I mean, yes, they kept the half agony, half hope quote, but cutting the part where he says that he still wants to be with her, like, why? Why? And just, like, why would you mess with it at all? It's perfect the way that it is. And then another change that, while it's not quite as significant, I think that it still has some serious implications for the story and makes the ending a little bit less well put together and believable. They cut the character of Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith was a friend of Anne's at school, and she is now an impoverished widow. Initially, Mrs. Smith is used to demonstrate Anne's integrity and kindness. She spends time with Mrs. Smith when she can get nothing out of it, nothing to benefit herself. And when they have made plans together, Anne keeps those plans, even at the expense of getting her family angry at her and missing what her father and sister consider to be like an exciting and important networking opportunity, more or less. Instead, in the new movie, Mrs. Smith isn't around, so we do see her meet Lady Dalrymple and Miss Carteret. And then we get the octopus scene. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. If not, I don't want to lose any brain cells trying to explain, but it is utterly ridiculous, and it is not a good substitute for her keeping her plans with her friend as opposed to going to see these people. No, it does not even compare. It was absurd, and it has no place there, and that is all I care to say. The problems continue, though, with the fact that Mrs. Smith is not around, because in the end, she is the one who tells Anne about what Mr. Elliot is doing, what he's planning, and, the secrets that he is keeping, and While, yes, he is very upfront about that, like I said, Anne doesn't need Mrs. Smith to tell her that Mr. Elliot is after her father's title. She knows he's after her father's title. He is very forthcoming about that. But Mrs. Smith also tells her that Mr. Elliot had also been courting Mrs. Clay, and was planning on both marrying Anne and making Mrs. Clay his mistress. So he was courting her with the intention of cheating on her once they were married. That completely changes the situation and makes it even more obvious that she dodged a bullet. In the movie, on the other hand, she finds out about him and Mrs. Clay because they are, I kid you not, kissing in public. He is kissing the woman that he wants to make his mistress in public while keeping her a secret from the woman he intends to marry. In the 19th century, no less, when public display of affection wasn't anywhere near as accepted as it is in the present day. But even in the present, kissing in public while keeping the relationship a secret would be just so dumb. So I really don't like the contrived way that they had that happen, particularly when it would have been so much easier to just include the character of Mrs. Smith, ditch the scene about the octopus, and have her find out that Mr. Elliot was planning on cheating on her in the way that she did in the book. So really what I'm left with when I think about this adaptation is, why on earth did they choose Persuasion? I am not against the idea of a modernized adaptation of a Jane Austen novel, even one that uses like the backdrop and whatnot of the time period. I don't think any of the techniques that they used, like main character makes snarky commentary at the camera or anything like that, would be wrong in the right context. It just didn't work for Persuasion, which makes me really confused as to why they used Persuasion as opposed to a different novel by Jane Austen. I could see Pride and Prejudice working pretty well. The main character has the kind of personality that they were going for one thing. And the story isn't nearly as somber as the one in Persuasion. There's plenty to laugh at in Pride and Prejudice. It being a more recognizable and familiar and frequently adapted book, I think would also make the idea of doing something a little bit experimental more palatable than one that's only had a couple of adaptations total. Or I actually think that something similar could have worked really well with Northanger Abbey, because Northanger Abbey has that feeling to it already. It is very humorous and doesn't take itself too seriously, pokes fun at its characters all the time. The main character, Catherine, while she's a lot more naive and gullible than they were going for in a main character, I could see them making the look at the camera and give commentary thing work with her, particularly if they were willing to poke fun at her in the way that the novel totally does. I don't think that I would be nearly as irritated if they had done something similar with Northanger Abbey. In fact, depending on how well it was executed, I would think that might be a pretty good take on the story, because it was in many ways already a parody. So why Persuasion? It certainly wasn't for name recognition, because it's definitely not the most well-known novel by Jane Austen. It wasn't because the story already fit with the kind of tone that they were wanting to give it. I just really can't wrap my head around it. Like, why Persuasion? What was it that made them want to adapt Persuasion in particular in a way that makes it no longer really Persuasion? In any case, if you're a fan of Jane Austen's novel Persuasion, I would go with either the 1995 or 2007 movies. I really love the 2007 version. It captures the spirit of the book in a way that this one doesn't. If you watched this movie without having read the book, please don't judge the book by the movie. Whether you liked it or not, give the book a read before you make any decisions about, how you feel about the book. Because I was gonna say it's so much better, but really it's so different that it's almost like comparing apples and oranges.